was a huge break. But at the same time, I also felt very overwhelmed because I had a lot of people counting on me. So one of the first things I did was call Susan Ravener, my editor. I'd worked with her on my first book, Thread of the Silkworm.
And she said, I'm wondering if Basic would agree if I paid for it to do a book that I want to do that's very important to my community. I said, we don't work that way. We're not going to take money from you. Either we're going to believe in the book and publish it, or we're not going to publish it. So tell me more about the topic. And she described the story of the rape of Nanking. I was fascinated. My entire career in publishing had been related to doing serious nonfiction books by academics. Here was an enormous topic of great importance, and yet not one academic, it appeared, had written about it. I think there's a big question to be asked and answered. Why did it need a child of the community to tell this story? And second, why had it disappeared from the history books?
She talked to people in the United States who had been there in Nanking at that time. She spent a lot of time in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Also, a lot of the people in Nanking were missionaries who were from Yale, and their records were in the Yale archives.
The first question we were asking is, what happened? Because the Japanese claimed one thing, the Chinese claimed something else. So by then we knew we wanted to tell the story Rashomon style 3 different ways. The first way would be from the perspective of the attackers, the Japanese, as they remembered the incident. The second time would be from the perspective of the victims, the Chinese, as they remembered the incident. But the critical factor was, were there independent people there who could either verify the Japanese side or the Chinese side? So very early on, we were focused on the independents.
When I started researching, I was surprised to find out that the rape of Nanking was front-page news at the time. Western journalists were actually living in the city when the Japanese invaded. They saw what happened with their own eyes, and their reports about the massacre were sent around the world. About 20 other Westerners stayed in Nanking as well. Businessmen, missionaries, diplomats, and doctors, and many of them wrote detailed diaries documenting the atrocities. John McGee, an American missionary, even filmed the victims. When I saw his footage, I couldn't believe how brutal the Japanese soldiers had been. Dr. Robert Wilson worked day and night treating horrifying wounds. Then there was Minnie Vautrin. She turned her women's college into a refugee camp. And German businessman John Rabe hid hundreds of people in his own house.
He was one of the foreigners who stayed in the city to create a 2.5 square mile area, which they called the safety zone. And they protected hundreds of thousands of Chinese from slaughter during the worst of this massacre.
When I read the diaries, I realized there was a whole other side to the story that nobody knew about. These people were as courageous as you'll ever find. They weren't larger-than-life characters. They were just ordinary people, scholars, missionaries who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. They were all heroes. You could have written a book about any one of them.
Wilhelmina Vautrin, or Minnie Vautrin as her friends called her, was a missionary who grew up in Secor, Illinois. And in 1937, she was the head of Jingling Women's College in Nanking. When Nanking fell to the Japanese, Vautrin turned the campus into a refugee camp. Thousands of the Chinese women and children poured into the zone with only the clothes on their backs. Soldiers would break into the camps at night and kidnap a few women before Vautrin and the other missionaries could stop them. Vautrin managed to rescue a few girls from the clutches of soldiers and ordered the Japanese out of the zone. But these men were not accustomed to dealing with strong women like Minnie Vautrin and slapped her around or threatened her with their bloodied swords, bayonets, and guns. Minnie Vautrin was a strong woman and a hero, but in the end, she found it impossible to sustain the mental torture of living in the hell that was Nanking. Because shortly after the massacre, she suffered a nervous breakdown and had to return to the United States. She never recovered, and Vautrin one day stopped up the cracks of the house, turned on the gas, and committed suicide.
Mimi's testimony really made a profound impression on Iris. And the fact after having lived through this and actually playing such a significant role in saving so many of the Chinese in Nanking, that she was so tormented that she committed suicide later. You know, that was something that, you know, it didn't let go of Iris's mind.
From 8:30 this morning until 8 this evening, I've stood at the front gate while the refugees poured in. I've heard scores of heartbreaking stories of girls who were taken from their homes last night. Tonight a truck passed in which there were 8 or 10 girls. And as it passed, they called out, "Jiu Ming, Jiu Ming, save our lives." Oh God, control the beastliness of the soldiers in Nanking tonight. Comfort the heartbroken mothers and fathers whose innocent sons have been shot today. And guard the young men and girls through the long, agonizing hours of this night. How ashamed the women of Japan would be if they knew these tales of horror.
And she said, I read the diary, I was crying. I was broke down right there, and she's crying. She said, she's really told me, if I finish Rape of Nanking, I'm going to publish this diary.
But you never had a chance to.
But she didn't have any chance.
Justice, silence for two. Trust me with your pain. I'll take it as my own. I'll fight to get the truth told. My weapon is my word.
She flew into Hong Kong, and she was going to take a train up to Nanking, and she thought she was going to get to sort of be a tourist for a few days. It was like a steam locomotive. There wasn't air conditioning in the car, and it was very, very crowded, and she got sick on that train ride, and she was sick her whole time she was in China after that.
I went to China in the summer of 1995, and I interviewed about a dozen survivors. There are still several hundred people in China who remember the atrocities vividly, who lived through them. This is why I wanted to write the book so quickly and get it done. I really felt an urgency here. I was afraid that if I waited too long, that all the voices from the rape of Nanking would be extinguished forever from old age.
Taxi!
She had already been to China in '93 to do research on threat of the silkworm, so she was comfortable getting around in China.
谢。
The Global Alliance hooked her up with the right people in China, and so she talked to them a lot over the phone and by email and regular mail in advance and got everything well lined up before she went.